Welcome, everyone, to our 1 o'clock panel on the Communities for the Future, Municipal Leadership-Doughnut Economics, and adapting to a changing climate, featuring two forward-looking municipal politicians, Ben Geselbracht and Tyler Brown, both of the regional municipality of Nanaimo. Nanaimo has become a deal city. That means Doughnut Economics Action Lab City, which is how Nanaimo and its progressive leaders came to our attention. You may find that donuts do not usually come to mind when discussing municipal politics. But in this case, they represent a brilliant economic model developed by Oxford economist Kate Raworth. The model is shaped like a donut. Requires intersectional thinking in planning, which is a topic that has arisen in many of our presentations already in this conference. And Ben and Tyler will explain the concept to you. So, Ben, you'll see in the bios, is currently president of the Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities. He's passionate about developing the green circular economy. He's chair of the Nanaimo Regional Solid Waste Committee. And he's particularly interested in mobilizing government to be more effective in supporting a resilient economy and is environmentally sustainable and meets the needs of all community members in central focus of his work. Tyler is his partner in crime, has the same goals, and has also an education and background working in urban planning and intergovernmental relations. So it's quite a dynamic duo, and they are really leaders, I think, in the country in how to apply the values that we're talking about in our last presentation by the UN ambassador, how to make those reality on the ground in a municipal situation. So over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Susan, for having us here. And we're zooming in from the traditional territories of the Nanaimo people here on Vancouver Island. And we're pleased to present. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully it works as practiced. And is that coming up?
Yeah,
looks good.
Be full screen.
Excellent. So, in 2018, the IPCC report gave us 12 years globally to have our emissions to avoid catastrophic changes to climate that would result from temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. These changes will and are already bringing permanent alterations of longstanding weather patterns and more frequent and extreme droughts, precipitation events, floods, heat waves, and windstorms. And the intensification of all this creates a cascading destruction that, on our current path, will lead to billions of dollars of damage in infrastructure, severe losses to biological productivity and biodiversity, massive disruptions to food systems, impacts on multiple fronts to human health, increasing social disorder, and mass human climate displacement and migration. Cities are especially vulnerable since they draw less on the resiliency of natural systems, have ill adapted infrastructure and greater population densities. And the severity of the impacts of climate change has gotten very real for many of us. This summer with the heat wave, it was pretty crazy going down to the ocean and having this intense smell of rotting flesh and seafood because all the clams and shellfish were baked in their shells during it. And the town of Lytton in BC hit an all-time Canadian record for heat. And then 2 days later, 90% of the town burnt down by a raging forest fire. And both Tyler and I, we grew up in Nanaimo with some of the freshest coastal air in the country, and I never had days growing up where the air quality rating presented immediate risk to our health. And his young son, however, in the same town, has had to be kept inside on 2 separate occasions in 2 different seasons before the age of 4 because the air quality was so bad from raging BC forest fires. So this is not the handoff any generation wants to leave to the next. Like most impacts, the most vulnerable in our community get hit first and the worst with climate change. For example, unlike Tyler's kid that was able to go inside to an air-conditioned space during these smoke events, there is now an alarming growing number of people in our little town, of 100,000 that are homeless and don't have the option to go inside. And this is really symbolic of how climate change will first start impacting society. This disadvantaged in our community and globally get hit first and the worst. And this makes mitigating and adapting to climate change not only an environmental and health issue, but also a social justice and human rights issue. So when we think of climate change, displacement, and the migration that will come, improving our society's ability to provide the basic needs for vulnerable people will be a major component of any well thought out adaptation strategy. So in the last 2020 IPCC report, it indicated that the lack of progress globally over the last 3 years has made it even less likely for us to keep below the catastrophic 1.5, even 2 degree threshold, unless we see a mass mobilization, public mobilization to rapidly transform our economy. And this makes the need for a concerted effort and adaptation all the more necessary, but ultimately there are limits to what society can adapt to. So no matter what, the only solution that we have going forward is an all-out mass mobilization, one that can concurrently enact a large-scale transformation to a low-carbon society, and that can maintain an economy that meets the needs of people in the face of a more chaotic and extreme climate that, even with our best efforts, will go into the next century. So the major challenge in achieving the social cohesion for this mass mobilization is the social inequity that we see not only globally, but within our borders. And this creates a political conflict. The gap that in many cases is growing of the lack of access to basic needs that many of our community members is facing, while others are enjoying extreme wealth, is something that must be addressed concurrently if we want to be successful in achieving the collective action that's needed to rise to the occasion. So unfortunately, as a society and globally, we're failing to effectively address both our environmental and social equity challenges with the demonstrable progress that's needed. And that's why what's needed in this moment is greater leadership, we believe, from government at all levels, since it's the only institutions that have the ability to coordinate at the scale and scope that's necessary to overcome these big problems. And the question is, how can we take leadership in our public institutions to help our communities adapt and, more importantly, become more adaptable to address the big challenges? So I'll segue here to Tyler to illustrate some approaches to do this.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, Ted. Good morning or good day to everyone. I know we're in different time zones. So, and I too am coming from the Nanaimo territory, Vancouver Island. So picking up where Ben left off there, both him and I represent, we were fortunate enough to be elected to Nanaimo City Council, and also British Columbia has a unique form of government called regional districts that is a federation of municipalities and unincorporated areas, and we also sit on there. So different... both local governments, but both with a different focus. But ultimately, there's a lot of overlap there in different initiatives and how they, from everything that we do, from sewer and water to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so just off the top, I know that we're talking a lot about adaptation at this conference, and Ben and I have had a lot of conversation on this, and we're sort of at the point where adaptation and mitigation are very, very blended. A lot of what we need to do for adaptation is also what we need to do for mitigation. So we kind of, philosophically, I think, weave between those two. And undoubtedly, municipalities are on the front lines and play an important role in taking leadership in the climate crisis, as they're most directly linked to the majority of people in Canada. We are an increasingly urbanized nation, and that has its challenges, but also I think it presents a real opportunity. And as a result of sort of the closeness to the ground that municipalities have with their people and with the cities that we live in, I would argue that they're in the best position to coordinate a response, both jurisdictionally, but also because we're responsible for many of the factors that drive climate change and that result in social disorder. Not responsible in the sense that it's a collection and sum of individual action, and obviously there's industry and all sorts of things. But we're very well positioned to interact and engage with people and address a lot of the daily contributing factors for most of us that are add to GHGs. So it's not only cities that are responsible for tackling the problem, don't get me wrong, but cities have a crucial and important role to play, especially when we consider how people live in cities, the daily choices that they make. So for the average person, city governments play the largest role in reducing their GHG footprint. The buildings we live in, the transportation choices we make, and the products we consume, and how they're disposed of are huge GHG drivers, and municipalities play a role in those three. So the city of Nanaimo, which we are on the council, is a city of 100,000 people. And when we graph what is causing our emissions, this is what we get. I've been showing here. So as you can see, some slight changes between 2010 and 2017. But ultimately, the biggest drivers for our city, and this probably holds true for most cities across the country, is buildings, transportation choices, and solid waste. Now, I just want to highlight that this is some graphing, and there's probably a discussion around how we track and account for solid waste in this country. I'm not going to dwell on that today because it is a little bit of a rabbit hole. But as you can see there, it shows up as about 5-6% for our city. So this shows us where we're at today, and we know we need to see serious reductions. If you're probably attending this conference, you know the severity of it, and we don't have to go into that. But the city of Nanaimo, like many other cities, has been making efforts over the last decade to reduce emissions. So if we go to the next graph here, we can take a look at that. And this is basically business as usual in the sense of efforts that have been put in place over the last couple of decades. And as you can see, this is the trajectory from the city of Nanaimo's Community Sustainability Action Plan. And, it's great. We see if we were to carry on this path, we see reductions in buildings, we see reductions in transportation. But even by 2050, we don't see even a 50% reduction in emissions, a target that we know we need to achieve by 2030. So that produces a problem for sure. And just to sort of add some numbers to this, in our city in 2050, by 2050, 89% of the building GHGs will be built from buildings built in 2021 or earlier. And 65% of our existing building stock will still exist in 2050. And even if we shift to transportation, where the longevity of a car or transportation choices like a building that gets built for 50 plus years. So if we take a look at that, 80% of transportation emissions in Nanaimo result from personal vehicle use. And although EV adoption is improving, the numbers from December of last year show that 0.9% of vehicles in Nanaimo are electric. And this is only estimated to increase to 12% by 2030. So vehicles and vehicle usage and EV usage is clearly not going to cause the gains that we need to see. And our city does have it was adopted at once in the wards. It's quite a forward-looking document. We have Transportation Master Plan developed about 5 or more years ago now, and it sets targets for modal shift. So if the modal shift targets are met, so moving people from their car to other modes such as biking, cycling, public transit, lower carbon modes, the goal was to see an increase from 12% to 25% by 2041, and reduce the amount of kilometers driven in a personal automobile by 29% by 2041. So even doing those two things, we would only see a GHG reduction of 17%. I highlight this essentially for two reasons. And I want to unpack that a little bit in a moment, but the two reasons are essentially this. True climate action is going to require a strong municipalities to really step up and start to deliver. And yes, they can do partnerships with the province and the federal government, but it has to be driven by the willingness of municipalities to tackle this crisis. Transportation choices and how we've built our buildings are fully within the realm of cities to tackle and have a huge role to play in how we reduce personal GHGs for all of us. So the narrative that cities, and I hear this a lot from other politicians, municipal politicians, members of the public, that this is not a city problem. I think that narrative has to be pushed back against and fully rejected, because we will not see the climate goals we need to meet nationally or globally if municipalities aren't stepping up. And the second item I think that just needs to be highlighted is that the policy response, even by the most progressive cities, I don't think Nanaimo has been the most progressive city, but they definitely haven't been lagging behind over the last couple of decades in terms of responding to climate change. But cities, by and large, have not responded to the challenge to the degree that it needs to be met. There's a few barriers for this, and that's what I want to sort of unpack. And drawing from my experience, both as the positions that Ben and I now occupy as elected members of City Council and on our regional district board, but also previous to that, my experience was working for municipalities, working in the field of urban planning as a staff member. And so this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just drawing from a bit of my experience in the conversations, some key reasons why I think we're not achieving what we need to achieve. And so, Ben, if we can go to the next slide. My apologies if my audio is cutting in and out. I just got to look here and see if I can correct that a little bit. So the four sort of reasons that I can identify is lack of vision, lack of coherence, the adoption of misguided frameworks, and poor communication. So, and when I speak to the lack of vision, there's a great line from the book Mission Economy. I hope many of you read it. If you haven't, it just came out and it's awesome. Mariana Mazzucato, Ben, correct my pronunciation later. But she has a great line that says, the government that lacks imagination will find it more difficult to create public value. And that has been my experience to date, that governments often have a barrier to their own success by selling themselves short. We self-limit and we accept common notions about what governments are. We're just regulators, we're bureaucrats, we're something that gets in the way. We don't innovate, we're a necessary evil. That has become, I think, internalized to a lot of governments and how they operate and how they see themselves. City government is different. And when it comes to city government, I often hear is city government is responsible for picking up my trash and filling potholes. Yeah, truth to that, but that's also false. A city government is about toilets that flush. It's this idea that there's core services. But my true belief is that we need to see ourselves as more because we are more. Cities predate the nations and provinces that currently govern us. They've been economic engines as long as they exist. And that ultimately they aim at communal goods. That's why we've come together. We've gathered in cities, and that's why cities exist. So I touched on a little more technical basis about how we're responsible for GHG actions and also how we might mitigate and adapt to this environment. But on a philosophical basis, where most cities are the most complex thing most of us interact with and engage in. And so they provide for us economically with jobs and opportunities. They provide for us socially with the interactions of leisure, culture, recreation, and they have a huge opportunity for climate crisis. And so we have to get rid of this belief that we aren't innovators or we don't have a role to play or we just get in people's way, because if we unlock the potentials of cities, we can meet a lot of our climate goals, and that's going to take ambition, but it's also going to take coherence. And my experience is that there is a lack of coherence. And Jonathan Rose, in his book, The Well-Tempered City, sort of sums this idea well. just as an equalizing tuning system permits 24 different musical scales to integrate and to influence one another for the first time, so cities need a framework to unify their many disparate programs, departments, and aspirations. When a community has a vision and a plan for how to carry it out and is able to coherently integrate its disparate elements, then it begins to be well-tempered. Coherence is essential for cities to thrive. So Ben and I know this very, very well, because when we started on council, newbies elected, and we were trying to figure everything out and make it make sense. Over the course of the first year, it became very clear that our city lacked coherence. We had many different departments doing many different things. Some of it good, some of it bad, and some of it neutral. But there was no clear framework that held it all together. What was it pointed at? What were the overarching values? How did it all come together? Whose vision was it? Which department was driving it? How did other departments contribute or participate in it? What was the vision that tied all that we were doing together? And when it came to the environment, just to a singular topic, there was also no overarching plan or vision for the city's efforts and initiatives. This became very apparent as we co-chaired environmental committee and sat on it with a group of citizens and was supported by staff. And you could see by all people present at the table that there was a lot of aimless conversation, lack of purpose, and frustration, and eventually frustration. Asked for an environmental framework, and staff did put something together, but then a new problem emerged. How did all those different elements and initiatives link to things across the city? It couldn't be easily siloed, nor should it be, but that's what it appeared to be happening. And so, for example, when you look at something like social transit, there's a social equity component, there's an environmental component. Talk to some businesses, there's a business component about getting people to work. And so when we're prioritizing items of what we fund or what we don't fund, what is the decision-making framework that ties that together? How do we choose one item over another? That really became a problem, both just in the environmental realm in which we were operating as that part chair, or as part of that committee, but also as city councils that are responsible for lots of departments together. And so from my experience in this, I don't think this was unique to the city of Nanaimo. It's been almost part of every local government that I've been involved with, and I've talked to many others and they experience the same thing and articulate it slightly differently, but we often hear about, it's overly siloed and things like that in organizations. And so a lot of municipalities and cities have adopted frameworks. I'm going to argue that and I'm going to only touch on this quickly, but some of these are really misguided. Very well-meaning, but a little bit misguided from where we are and to where we need to go. The two frameworks that I've come across the most are triple bottom line accounting and the three pillars of sustainability. Again, really well-intentioned, but each of these treats economic value as an end in itself. And I contrast that with the donut, and I'll get that up on the screen here in a sec, which has a social foundation on the inner ring, which is based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that's the inner edge of the donut. And those are sort of the values that we believe or that every human should have, right to housing, right to freedom, essentially to have the capacity to become who you want to become. And then there's the planetary boundaries on the outer edge, or the ecological ceiling that defines sort of the hard limits based on science of what our activities on this planet, this oasis in space, can absorb. And you'll notice that there is no sort of separate economic aspect. Economics here is a means to achieving those ends. And I think that's unique and different and ultimately very important about the donut, is economics is a means, not an end. It is a crucial distinction here, because economics is an activity in which we realize the social foundations while respecting the scientific limitations of our planet. And finally, this is something from a political aspect I think Ben and I became very aware of, is that in order to bring public along, the staff along, you have to communicate what you're doing. It's not just what you're doing, but it's about why you're doing it. And people need to be able to see themselves in it and see their values expressed. And the beauty of the donut is it creates the coherence that I've been talking about for different initiatives and easily communicates them to the public and to staff. It sets a clear vision rather intuitively in the way the model has been graphed and shown. And many different members of the public can find the values or the things that are of interest to them, whether it's the environment or whether it's the social, and for some it's all of it. They can find themselves in it. They can see how we're doing. So it's not just a superficial way of communication. It can be very simple on the surface, but for policy sort of geeks like me, is you can start to see how it's fundamentally intersectional. So how's the environment connect to your social values? And more importantly, we can quantify them and track them to see how we're doing over time. So the donut as a whole provides a vision and coherence for the city. Right in my mind, it rightfully places economics as a means to an end and easily communicates that vision and coherence in a way that showcases performance through indicators and how the city is doing in its progress on those. So in short, the donut provides a vision, a mission-oriented approach, and the ability to guide policy development and decision-making in one model. And it links eco-justice with social justice to drive and track a change. So this is an example, if we go back just one there, Ben, of the donut for the Earth. And as you can easily see, the red shows that we are overshooting planetary boundaries in a big way. On the outer edge, the ecological ceiling. And on the inner edge, for the social foundation, we've fallen short globally. This differs from country to country. Some are doing far better on the social foundation, while others, and usually developing nations, are doing far better on the environmental side, just because they haven't industrialized like we have in Canada. The inner edge there, the social foundation, is built on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are values that most of the world government have adopted. And the sweet spot of the donut is the green there. And this is where our economic activity operates in to deliver on those social foundations. And we must do that within the planetary boundaries. So this model here shows us how we can orient ourselves to the task at hand in a way that many can easily understand, see themselves in, and ultimately track. So Ben will describe now, I'll turn it over to him, how we're adapting the donut for Nanaimo, realizing it at a municipal level. And just there's a lot, this is a very ongoing process. There's a lot of work being done and continue to be done. There will be mistakes made, but Ben's going to give you a snapshot of how we got here and where we're at.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. So the donut model, shown on the screen is at a global level, and the art is now taking that concept of developing a community that operates within the ecological limits of the planet to meet and meets the needs of the community. And so the process of taking this model and putting it to the context of the community was developed first in Amsterdam. Kate Rayworth, who developed the donut model, worked with the city of Amsterdam and C40 cities and circular economy to create a planning methodology of downscaling. They call downscaling the donut to the scale of the city. And so the story of the Nanaimo City Donut is, Tyler and I first brought the motion forward to our council that the city of Nanaimo adopt the donut economic model as a cohesive vision for all city initiatives and planning processes, and that the city portrait for Nanaimo be created to scale down the donut economics framework, and that the city portrait be blended with our official community plan process. That motion, it passed 5-4 because, we brought it quite quickly to council so that we could dovetail it with our official community plan process, which had already mobilized considerable resources for public engagement in that. And I think that with more time, more councillors have been brought on board, but there was, if you quickly Google problems with the donut framework, there's things that it's anti-growth, anti-development, anti-business, which couldn't be farther from the truth. And really it's a model of how to guide a vision so that you can have prosperity that exists within a community, within the ecological boundaries but meeting the needs of people. And so the question that you ask the community to begin this process is, how can Nanaimo become a thriving home to people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And this exists in sort of 4 quadrants: the local ecological, the local social, and then also how can our city take responsibility for our impacts outside of our border, on the planet impacts, and also on people outside of our border. So the Nanaimo Donut starts with these goals. On the outer rim is, for resilient and regenerative ecosystems. And then for the social foundations, we have 4 key goal areas for community well-being, equitable access, mobility, diversity, culture, and reconciliation, and social integrity, and economic prosperity and resiliency. Those social foundations always must operate within our ecological boundaries on the outer rim. So the main process of bringing the donut to the context and scale of the city is going through a process of setting goals and then identifying targets and indicators to reach those goals. And that's really the power of the donut framework, is that it can identify the vision with a set of goals, but then also bring it down to a set of measurable outcomes that can be tracked to allow for a yardstick to measure what success is. And that's really what the donut is trying to do, is change the concept of what success is and make it very clear what is success for the community. And so we had to do this over Zoom during our official community plan process. But it was very successful in having a community dialogue around these key areas. And so examples of goals that we came up with, for our ecological ceiling, of course, is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions below, to do our fair share to meet that 1.5 Celsius threshold. So that's reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. Another key goal is to meet a waste reduction goal of reducing our waste that goes to landfill by 50%. And that's in line with an ambitious regional district goal that's around 90% diversion of waste from landfill. Within our ecological commitments, we're setting targets for a certain amount of land that will be protected within our municipal boundaries. Also tree canopy goals, and then goals around water conservation and water quality. And these are large scale indicators that our sub plans that will support them will be broken down into more refined and granular targets and indicators. For the social foundation, we've set a goal that everyone has the opportunity to have healthy, safe, and affordable housing and food. And we've goals around reducing the amount of people that are experiencing chronic and episodic homelessness, having goals around rental housing and affordability, vacancy rate, mix of housing types. We've got a goal around the opportunity for to connect and participate in ways that are fulfilling. So we're developing a goal and target indicators around inclusion and diversity. And it's one that staff haven't come up yet with a meaningful indicator and target that could capture the intention. And this is part of the process of developing this in a way that would be useful for city planning. Also, goal around safe, affordable, and sustainable options to move and access daily needs. And we have goals and targets around transportation by mode, trying to get a mode shift from vehicles, reducing the amount of distance driven, the accessibility to daily needs. And in another section, we have goals around that everyone has an opportunity to find employment and that businesses can thrive. And so we're looking at measures of the type of businesses and the diversity of represented for different sectors, so that we've got a balanced economy, and looking at our distribution of our demographics, that we have a good balance between the different age groups in society. So how we're applying this set of goals now in our city's planning processes, so that we can get that coherence across departments, so that we're not working in silos and that we're all working towards these larger goals, is varied and appears in different ways. One of the biggest initiatives that we have right now is our official community plan, which we're setting out a series of different land use scenarios for our city to grow into. So there's a lot of mapping that's going on, and this is a map that's showing the distance traveled, on each spot of the community for the degree of walkability. But we have these three different scenarios. If we grow and develop our city along the current path, one that has this concept of mobility hubs, and one that's centralizing growth more around our downtown core. And so what we do is to decide, to help our decision in what land use planning scenario to take, we've taken our donut goals and evaluated, done modeling to evaluate the merit of each of these different scenarios. So here's the evaluation of the current path. This is one for the central focus of concentrating growth in more of the downtown area. And then we've got a thing that can compare them. And you can see that some scenarios perform a lot better on the indicators. The central focus and the mobility hubs is showing that it can develop a city with a much better ability to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, protecting natural areas, allowing for a diversity of housing, better access to social services, a better distribution for industrial lands. And so it's become a very concrete evaluative tool to make decisions. How this all fits together, and during our official community plan, we've also intentionally updated our Parks and Recreation Master Plan, our Climate Action Plan, our Active Transportation Plan, our Community Climate Adaptation Plan, all in the same go, so that each of these separate plans that previously were done at different times and would have disparate goals are all integrated together under the common vision of the donut. So an example of one of our plans is our climate resiliency strategy. That is focusing on climate adaptation. And Tyler mentioned earlier, adaptation and mitigation really are part and parcel of the same thing. And, we have previously discussed them as separate entities. And, this particular diagram shows where they overlap. But when you really get into looking at mitigation, when you're building more compact communities, you start to see that they're a lot more affordable. And when we look at the pressures that climate is going to have on affordability and all the additional costs, building a more affordable city that's easier to move around in also has a large adaptation merit. So in our adaptation plan, we're looking at areas of action around our water supply, because we're seeing that our snowpack is going to reduce, and that really supplies our water and replenishes our storage capacity over the winter, dealing with flooding and drainage. And this ties into goals that we have in the donut around tree canopy and land protected areas, because we're noticing that these natural assets have a better ability to absorb water and direct flow without the use of more costly gray infrastructure. We've got goals for adaptation in our parks and recreation, well-being and preparedness. Spoke to it a little bit earlier about the location of our social services, and that in times of the heat dome or in very bad winter weather, people need a place to go to have their basic housing needs met, and we need to be planning for that. And then there's areas in land use and buildings, making sure that we're going through our city zoning bylaws and building code to ensure that we're being built for the future. Another key area of focus within the donut is our health and housing action plan. We have a homelessness issue in Nanaimo. Basically, our homeless population has almost doubled, tripled over the last 10 years. And some very concerted action is needed on that front. And so we've working on a model of developing almost a municipal crown corporation that will be coordinating all the social service providers in our city, along with linking and communicating with the provincial government to build out what we need to address this situation. And, when we could be looking at greater migration to countries like Canada because of folks that are, climate refugees, we need to make sure that we have our social systems dialed to be able to sustain and be resilient in the face of that and be able to integrate people into our community in a healthy way. Another focus, and Tyler will speak to it, is zero waste and circular economy as a strategy.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick because essentially, we all create waste, and there is the waste stream. So we've adopted. This is really by good work with Ben and some others in the community, even prior to where he was elected. We adopted a 90% waste diversion target. So essentially, making sure that 90% of our waste isn't actually waste. It's either it starts to achieve circularity where it can be remanufactured, whether it's into soils and that sort of thing through compost, or into creating new product streams where we can take things that would normally end up in the landfill, be recycled or reused or remanufactured different products. So what's interesting here is it's not just taking the lens of around the recycling aspect of it. Is how do we actually make a business model where private industry can reuse what was essentially to be waste into brand new products that will then again serve the population. Do so as locally as possible.
And with our donut model, we really need to go through different aspects of the city's operations and financing to meet those values. And we have recently a sustainable and social procurement policy because the city spends an incredible amount of money, and we want to focus that investment into the community and in ways that is helping us products and services that reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, are mindful of the waste production, and also provide social investment, providing jobs and employment for the diversity that exists in our community. And bringing the donut into our financing, ultimately it needs to show up in the way that we evaluate the success of our budget. And, we've started the initial stages of looking at how to do that. But ultimately, the success of a budget is how well it's meeting our goals, and we need to have that type of outcome-based budgeting. And so that's an area of focus that we'd like to work on further.
This is excellent, gentlemen, and I'm hoping you're going to come to a close soon so that we will have some questions, because I have a few in my mind already, and I know there will be lots.
Excellent. Yeah, I think, we can wrap up here. I think that to deal with the challenges that we are facing, we are going to need to amp up, the institution that's in the place to take leadership is our public institutions, and we need to amp up our effort in that. And it's been a fight. The policies in the past have been around, can be seen in Reagan's statement. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And I think that we need to change that around, and it starts with setting that strong vision and a purpose, and then very clear goals, and mobilizing our resources and demonstrating, effectiveness in moving the dial on that. And so that's the work that's ahead of us, and what we've been trying to focus on, and believe that the donut model is something that can help us achieve this. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this description. It was it is quite complicated to get the intersectionality established, and I am delighted to see that and how you're working that out. I'm supposed to start my video. Okay. Sorry, I'm glad to see the way you've worked out the intersectionality, and I know that it'll be a benefit to each one of your plans, including the adaptation plan. And it's very interesting also to see the overlap between the climate mitigation plan and the adaptation plan, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that. I'm particularly interested in how you keep the entire council on focus on the donut model, but also in particular making these changes relating to climate change so that it's not business as usual for the adaptation in particular, since it addresses the most vulnerable in the community. Can anybody make a comment on that?
So I think there's work to be done there. And I would say what we're working towards is that in all our business planning and all our reports that come to council, that there will be a donut decision-making framework. So your point there around intersectionality is absolutely crucial as we move forward. And on any given initiative, it might have a more social aspect around providing for people in the near term. And we need to be able to see what are the trade-offs of any given decision. So right now we're doing that at a very high level, but I think where we need to be getting to and we are getting to is that we'll have more outcome-based budgeting, because budgeting is ultimately our most important document, but also a decision-making framework or lens or matrix that will be included in almost every single report that comes to council to remind them this is what we have adopted. And these are the values that are articulated here, and this is how any given initiative may add to one or take away from another if you go this way.
So you're saying communication.
And reminders, yes.
Reminders, okay. I have a question in the Q&A from Mike Nickerson, and he's wondering about cultural adaptation in terms of our own thoughts about reducing resource exploitation and reducing consumption, because he says belt tightening lacks broad appeal, and pointing out what we can reclaim works better, like more time for relationships, nature, creativity, learning. And has that come up in your discussions?
Just trying to get clear on the question is that, trying to find the motivation and what to motivate people to shift their habits and less from what you need to be giving up to more to what can you focus on to feel fulfilled.
That's right. His mantra is more fun, less stuff.
I think that is, at the heart of it is changing the focus. And I think that it is back to just starting with very clear vision and what the goals are, and then continually communicating, are we achieving these goals or not? And if we're not, having that, being very honest about that and showing the impacts of what it looks like. And I think ultimately, as the impacts of our lifestyle become more and more in our face, like when you go down to the ocean and you see, millions of dead shellfish, or you got to keep your kid inside because you can't breathe, I think the motivation builds more. And that's where we have to draw on to make that shift and do what we can to make that easier for people in the interim.
Thank you. I have a question here from Richard Harmston saying, what are the key impediments or opposition you anticipate to implement your adaptation plan, say between now and 2030?
I think this is a simple answer, but probably for a lot of things, it just comes down to political will. Getting people at the table to do what we know we must do can be difficult. But I think I'll come back to some of the power of the donut is, while someone might not be convinced on an environmental aspect, when you can show how there's an intersection. I like to use the example of transit because it's such a clean example of intersectionality, is that someone might be opposed to, and we very much experienced this, opposed to increasing transit for environmental reasons. They're not convinced the science or things like that. However, you can also build the case that transit is a very much part of affordable living. And so while someone might come at something from a strong social justice aspect, the power of intersectionality is many different people can see themselves or see a solution, or one item as a solution for many given problems, and that can bring people on board. So, it is political will, it is community will about how do we implement some of these things we know we have to implement, but the goal is, the model allows us to maybe come at that from different angles that we might not have come at before and sort of build a coalition around them.
So you're saying that the intersectionality is a difficulty and an asset, both.
It is an asset because it can create alliances where maybe you normally didn't see them.
Right. Thank you. We have a question here from Sausan Refi. Have you tried applying some of the donut actions already to see if what results it's yielding? Are there success stories where it was applied that you could share with us? She says she has a sense that it's more suitable for smaller cities than larger ones. What do you think of that?
I think the beauty of the donut is that the general concept is taking responsibility to be within your environmental limits and meeting the needs of the people that you serve and for your organization. So it can be applied to organizations, businesses, cities of all different scales, towns, the scale of a province or even of a country. And you go through a process of building what does it mean for your particular context to take responsibility for your impacts on the environment and be within your environmental limits, and to provide the needs of the people that you are in relationship with. And so I think that it serves everything. And then in terms of the application of it, this thinking, I think is in a lot of people already. And so different aspects of donut thinking has been part in our city process for a long time. And we see, and I think, having our sustainable procurement policy is an example where I had a friend in the engineering department, and he phoned me up. He's like, Ben, ever since the sustainable procurement policy, we're building a new fire hall, and I had to phone around to all these different vendors who are building the bunk beds to see, if they're made in a way that it was, in a way that had good employment practices and were made out of renewable goods. And I think that's demonstration of it percolating down into the actual day-to-day application.
That's a lovely example. I'm wondering though, sorry, about the larger cities, in that although we would want them to have those same goals, and they are of course essential to our survival, I've always been disappointed to see some very large corporations seem to be sort of detached from reality, and they tend to center more in the larger cities. And I'm wondering, for example, if you've had problems with large development companies, or do you have other pressures on you from outside of Nanaimo that might create difficulties in your plan?
100%, and I think, those tensions, as we nail this down even further, and those tensions will emerge, and that will be the courage of ultimately come to the courage of councils, provincials, and federal governments. Is sort of, do they have the mettle to push back against some of this stuff and say, no, sorry, that type of activity just doesn't fit. And I think there's no easy answer for that. It's really going to come down to the courage of convictions at our council table and future council tables in Nanaimo, and across the country.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Roy Culpepper asking, could you say something about the principal impacts of climate change on infrastructure? and the principal adaptation strategies in the municipality to make the infrastructure more resilient. The same question can be applied to impact on building resilience of households against the extreme weather events.
I've got an example, that we recently experienced. In 2018, we had huge windstorm, and on Vancouver Island, I think 150,000 houses went without power for a couple of days. But in that process, the windstorm took out the power to our water purification plant. And when the power went off, it was a brand new plant that we'd built. And there was a problem with the generator. And then all of a sudden, our whole town was without water that was being purified. And I think we had like 3 or 4 days before the stuff that was already in the pipe would be used up. That's a problem with our system, because we're going to be having more and more larger scale windstorms, and we really need to think about the resiliency of our electrical grid. And for our water supply system, we needed to put an extra valve so that we had an emergency shunt that would go around the purification plant in the case that we couldn't, so that at the very least we could get water to the community, even if they had to boil it. Before that, we didn't. And so it's that type of thinking, when we look at the amount of flooding, increased flooding that we're going to have, and our streams, to make sure that our sewer pipes are properly sized, and that instead of just relying on sewer pipes, that we're making sure that the overland flow patterns are, through the city and, are clear and functional for when we get those heavy rain events. And, Tyler may have some ideas around buildings and that.
Yeah, I would just say that to your last point there, we're already having to go in and replace existing infrastructure before its end of life, because it's unable to handle stormwater flows that weren't anticipated. So the modeling, 1 in 50-year events are now sort of increasingly becoming 1 in 5, 1 in 10-year events, and they're causing major backflooding. And in certain cases, they are spilling out onto private property and flooding private property. So we're having to invest in hard infrastructure to essentially, what would have been oversizing is now called right-sizing because of increasing, changing climate patterns. So that's city infrastructure is having an impact on private property as well. So, we don't want to engineer ourselves out of that. So as Ben indicated, we've come up with standards that within streetways and with private development that we can create more permeable surfaces, so we can absorb that water into more naturalized systems to delay that. And that's what an adapting municipality looks like. And here's the thing: is it costs money. It costs more money than was anticipated. So it's an example of, even if people didn't want to get into mitigation efforts, now they're starting to really see the actual cost of adapting. And my gut tells me that we're on the beginning edge of that, and we'll see escalating prices, and there's a lot of research that backs that up. So, these are challenges we're going to have to grapple with, and it's not just a public matter, it's not just a private matter. In many cases, we're seeing it's both, and how the private interacts with the public realm is crucial in terms of how we're going to adapt.
I'll follow up with this next question, which is, we saw many examples from a presentation on Prince Edward Island. For example, houses just floating out to sea and increased land loss. Dramatically increased land loss along the coastal areas. And I'm wondering, because Nanaimo is likely to have this sea-rise problem, if you've thought of moving buildings, municipal buildings, services, homes, and if you've thought about any kind of natural or hard protection at the coastlines.
Yeah, one area jumps out is, we're a coastal town, and a long time dream, as many people here, has been sort of a seawall that rivals Stanley Park in Vancouver or something similar. So as we look to put that together, originally, we would do do that type of planning, you look at it from a recreation purpose. We sort of pumped the brakes on that and said, okay, we need to look at this differently. We know the sea level is going to rise by a certain degree. And, that's a calculation because there's crustal uplift and all those sorts of things that can need to be calculated for to the degree where it happens in a localized manner. But, on this area of coastline, there's already a lot of erosion. There's a used harbor that saw a lot of degradation to eelgrass and things like that, natural ecosystems. So stepping back and taking a look at that project a little more holistically, we can start to say, well, okay, we can provide for people in a recreational, cultural way, because there's obviously a strong First Nations element with the coast there. But as we build this thing, we can build it to accommodate sea level rise. We can build it to be a really prominent active transportation route and start to meet some of the modal shift goals that we have. We can build it not just to be a seawall, but we can actually rebuild the beach and rebuild the habitat for that eelgrass to, restore that ecosystem that's been lost for decades. And we can do all those things in a singular project. So I just highlight that as an example of, yes, we're having to look at how we're going to adapt our projects, but we can look at more than just adaptation. So we can say, well, how can we actually make the world better, even though what's driving us to maybe take a pause and a look at how we do this is the need to adapt. So again, I think that's the overlap of mitigation and adaptation, just the genuine willingness to try to make the world better, is that what forces you to maybe make a decision is the point that you pause, but you can use that point of pause to really step back and say, okay, how can we make something that we have to do a net benefit on many different fronts?
I think that's a very good point. We have another question from Sausan saying, can you tell us more about your city's mitigation of future pandemic? Was that included in your planning?
I think that's a very important point to raise. We do know that with climate change, as we continue to move into areas that were previously unpopulated, the contact and just the farming practices, contact with viruses is increasing, and then as temperatures increase, the band of we're going to see, greater types of viruses and exposure, probably up higher, more into temperate regions than we've experienced in the past. And I think that this is something that's a serious consideration, and it's been good in a certain way of having to go through the pandemic here to bring our awareness that this is potentially a reality that we'll be facing more frequently. And to this date, we haven't really intentionally, because we're right in the middle of it, started to include that planning into our long-term plans. And I think that's a really good point raised, and something that we probably should attend to more.
Great. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for this presentation. It has been fascinating. And I know a number of people already who couldn't make it this afternoon who will be wanting to watch this as a recording in the future. And so we wish you the absolutely best. And I'm hoping to check back in with you in a year or so and see how you're doing. It's such an exciting process. And thank you very much for taking your time to present and prepare.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.